Good morning. We're having another episode, or one more chapter in the story of memories from rural southern Michigan on or around 1940. And this time I've brought a map for you, so if you look at the map you'll notice that we are talking about an area centered around Fulton here, which is located exactly here. And you notice it's 23 miles to Kalamazoo. It's about 18 and a half to Battle Creek. And this is the area of rural background, and it's the area from where all these memories arise. I'd like to start out today with a particular memory that I cannot remember myself because it happened when I was about 2 and a half, but it was related to me by one of my older brothers, that a particular incident occurred after I had spent time staying with cousins, Orville and Marie Kessler. Marie was the daughter of my aunt. And I had stayed with them because my mother went to Kalamazoo for a gallbladder operation, and the youngest were farmed out. My brother Dick one place, and myself with Orville and Marie. And my brother told me that while there, at almost 3 years of age, that Orville had a problem with me because I kept picking up rocks as heavy as I could lift and put over the edge and drop into his horse tank. And Orville had to keep cleaning them out, but he didn't really want to discipline me. I didn't seem to understand what I should know. But the most interesting thing that developed from that is when my mother came home, I was brought back to our farm, and we were all sitting at the kitchen table for the evening supper. And of course, that's where you hear the most stories. That's where all the gossip is exchanged. That's where you find out what's occurring in the neighborhood here and there. It's an excellent place. Somebody at the table is going to have been to the county fair the night before, if it's Sunday at least, or to a barn dance or something, and they're going to comment on the conduct of someone who drank alcoholic beverages and became what my father always referred to as tighter than a hoot owl. But that's where you heard all the gossip about everything at the table, and little ears digest the gossip, live with it a long time, and then you don't really understand what all of it means until later in your life. It's just names, people, words, but you know who they are, and they are associated with your neighborhood. Well, the most interesting story that came out of my time with Orville and Marie is my next oldest brother, who would have been in high school at the time, asked me at the dinner table, did I enjoy staying with Orville and Marie, and did I sleep in the same room with Orville and Marie? And my response to that was yes. Orville climbed on top of Marie, and she couldn't get him off, which created nice reporting for the supper table in this home on the farm. Either way, I would like to tell you a story that I do remember, and of course my memory has been rehearsed by many others older because they like to tell this story again and again. But I do remember this very specifically occurring. And it was when I would have been approaching 4 years of age, and it was on the 4th of July, which was a weekday, so it's not Sunday dinner day, but it's a day in which relatives gather at one farm or another. And we were going to have an aunt and uncle, a cousin and his wife, and their 2 children would be there, and one of them was a boy who was just older than my brother. If I were approaching 4, my brother would have been almost 5, and this cousin would have been 5 and a half. And they would arrive mid-morning, so after the chores were completed and about the time when your mother is hacking the head off 2 or 3 chickens to make chicken and dumplings with that delicious gravy, pulling the pin feathers and other things, mid-morning on a hot summer 4th of July, my brother loaded my cousin, my brother, and myself in the back of the pickup truck and drove 11 miles to the west, south of Kalamazoo, but to the west, to a town called Vicksburg, which to me was a large town because it had about 1,800 people and a high school, 2 farm implement dealerships. It even had a moving picture theater, which was open 7 nights a week and called the Sun Theater, and that's the closest one located to our farm. And so we usually went there at least once a week or once every other week to see a movie of one kind or another. So we were loaded in the back on this hot day, and my brother drove there. And one of the families that lived in the town also had a moonlighting type of occupation. They had built an insulated ice house behind their own home in the backyard. It wasn't very large, probably 4 times the size of an outdoor toilet, but it was well insulated, and there were no cooler systems or running contraptions to keep things cold, but ice was delivered there, and it wouldn't melt quickly, and the more ice you had in there, the more it helped the other ice to keep from thawing. And my brother paid 25 cents a block for 50-pound blocks of ice, took 2 of them, put them in the truck on burlap, and then wrapped them in burlap. We entered the truck again and rode back to our farm. Now it's about 11 o'clock, and my brother puts the 2 blocks of ice in our cellar. Now, a cellar is not a basement. A basement, you think of a living area. This is a cellar that has dirt walls. It does have a cement floor through much of it, but not in the area where we ultimately had a furnace by the time I was 6 years old. We moved beyond the pot-bellied stove stage to a downstairs furnace. And so in this cellar, the temperature, even on hot days, 90 degrees in July, wouldn't rise above about 52 or 53. And at that time, at that age, my brother and I were usually dressed by my mother in coveralls. And they were those striped coveralls, the kind of jeans that you associate with railway engineers at that time, with little grayish and white stripes. And the coveralls buttoned up the front, and then there was a trap door in the back with 5 buttons to take care of the bodily habits. If you wore it in the wintertime, then you had to have long underwear that had the same type of arrangements, so you had double rows of buttons inside and outside when you went to your outdoor toilet. We did not have an indoor toilet until I was 10 years old. So that's how we would have been dressed at this time. I think my cousin was probably dressed the same way. So the ice was placed in the cellar so it wouldn't melt, because we were going to use it that afternoon to make homemade ice cream in the summertime, and that is a specialty. The wintertime, it's no complication at all. We had the standard crank ice cream maker. It was made of wood. It would hold about 5 gallons in terms of total capacity, and there was an apparatus across the top that you sealed on with the crank, and a container that went down the center of it that my mother placed her homemade custard in for the ice cream. That would hold 2 gallons, but she wouldn't fill it all the way because there was a paddle apparatus that fit into it so that the ice cream or the custard would continually be stirred until the ice cream was at the proper texture to where you could hardly turn the handle and you knew your ice cream was done. If it's in the wintertime, you don't buy ice. You merely chop ice out of the horse tank every day because the top freezes during the night, and you stack it on the side. You always had a large mound of chunks of ice you chopped out of the horse tank and elevated out with a 5-tine pitchfork. So all you would do is place that ice inside a burlap bag, hit it with the flat of an axe until you'd crumbled it to make crushed ice, and that's what you would place around this cylinder that fit in the middle of your ice cream maker, and then you added ice from time to time as it melted and you were cranking. For preservation, you didn't have to worry in the wintertime because whatever wasn't eaten, you could just take the cylinder out, push some snow aside, and shove it down about 2 feet in the snow and cover it up, and you knew where your leftover ice cream was. But in the summer, it was a special treat because you had to buy the ice in block, and then you would have to break up the ice, and then under a shade tree in the yard, you would crank it, and this was very, very special for a boy my age, especially on a hot summer day in July. Now, being the 4th of July, we had already put out a row of flags along the grassy bank that moved on down to the gravel road in front of our house. My father had 1 large flag and 5 small flags. We put those out always on the 4th of July. So the ice is placed in the basement, and large doors open this way from the ground, and you go down steps into the basement. And my brother and I and my cousin went down in the basement to look at the ice while the adults were out in the yard, and they'd brought chairs out and were sitting in the yard visiting and talking about what, I don't know, how many bushel to the acre, whatever farmers might be talking about. The same thing they talk about in gas stations around pot-bellied stoves. We went downstairs, and my cousin had a watch. Not this kind he carried. And we went downstairs and looked at the ice, and we put the burlap back on one of the blocks of ice, and we decided to have a contest. And what we would do is we would take down the trap doors of our coveralls and sit bare bottom on the ice for as long as we could stand the cold. And in the meantime, somebody had to carry the time and time the operation with their watch. But the difficulty was that nobody agreed on who was being accurate in their timing. So we had difficulties and arguments over whether someone had counted too fast or had not looked at the watch properly, so forth. And in our dispute over who was able to sit on the cold block of ice bare bottom the longest, the adults heard the commotion in the basement and came down and, of course, reprimanded us for not keeping the ice covered. And we buttoned up our trap doors and went on up out in the yard and decided to climb the straw stack or do some other activity that you might do on a farm at that time. But either way, I could never forget that, even though I don't remember all the details about it. I remember all that I've told you, but I was rehearsed in that this is a story my mother loved to tell again and again, even when I was 25 years old. She liked to tell that story. So the ice is very, very important, especially if you have to go to retrieve it, bring it, and then you can have it on a special day in the summertime. And of course, there would be 18 people eating at our house that day, and we might even set up something so you could eat in the yard. But the standard fare for a day like that, as well as every Sunday, unless it varied because of pheasants that you had shot or rabbits that you had shot, the standard fare on a Sunday would always be chicken. And my mother usually made it with dumplings and gravy, whereas my aunt, who would have been there that day, she was famous for her fried chicken. The Marie of Orville and Marie always brought a 3-layer cake with mashed raisin icing, a yellow cake with mashed raisin icing. That's what her chief contribution always was, and everyone looked forward to the certain item that was brought by someone. My Aunt Annie was excellent at baked beans. Nobody baked beans quite like Aunt Annie, her fried chicken and baked beans. So that is one of the earliest episodes or activities I can possibly remember in my youth. I can't think of any others of that type. But I want to talk about the small town 1.25 miles to the north of us called Fulton, Michigan. And Fulton is a very interesting place. It was laid out, it's a single crossroads, and on one corner there was a store, a grocery store of a general type. Kitty-cornered across was a smaller structure, which was also a grocery store, but sometimes it was in business and sometimes it was not. Sometimes we had 2 stores. Next to the one that was kitty-cornered on the 4 corners was a vacant area about the equivalent of maybe 1.5 acres. It led back to something we called the hotel, although it did not function as a hotel anymore. It functioned as a kind of ice cream parlor where you could buy tissue and a few other sundry items. But in that grassy area were 2 lines, pins, and stakes, and that's where horseshoe was played in the town in fair weather. So very, very important location. On each other corner there were gas stations. One gas station, the Sinclair, was always in operation, and it was the more popular place. A different brand of gas, I don't remember which, was sold at the other gas station. That station functioned for gas from time to time, but was in a large structure that moved on back along the road, and in that structure was a garage where one could work on 4 or 5 cars, so there was always a mechanic who was present there to work on automobiles in the area. Right next to it, in the rear of it from the road, was a little structure about the size of a normal house trailer, a small house trailer. And that structure kind of elevated, and that was a tinker's shop. And George Hope did his tinkering there. He was the individual in the town who always came, rented a room close by. He always came and he put on those trousers with suspenders, trousers that now look like patent leather. They had so much grease over a long period of time, but those loose trousers were used for all of his work in the tinker shop. He is the individual that repaired your hair clippers, He could make almost anything. He once made a steam engine that only stood this high, and then whenever the kids would come by, he would run it for them, and it would, and it was all very impressive for individuals who were 4, 5, 6 years old. But he could fix or make almost anything in his machine shop. He had the proper lathes, all the other things, and that is what he did for his living. Absolutely fit the word tinker. And I grew up knowing what a tinker would be, because he's the man that took care of problems with bicycles and with lawnmowers and sharpened other cutting instruments of one kind or another. By the way, I might slip up to the modern time. Then after I had been teaching at Arizona State University for about 15 years, and it was in a class of 40 students, and they were all upperclassmen, senior types, and I once made a statement in the class, and I knew by this time in the class who was the student who had the best grades. And there were 45 students in the class. And I made the statement that Otto von Bismarck of Germany was able to pass proper anti-socialist and radical legislation because a demented tinker attempted to assassinate the Kaiser of Germany. And this young man's hand shot up, evidently the brightest one in the class. I thought he was going to ask me about the assassination. His question was, what is a tinker? So it depends on when you grow up and what circumstances you face when you grow up. Either way, back to our town of Fulton. Population, somewhere between 100 and 105. It varied from time to time. From the four corners of the town, you would have homes moving out no more than a quarter of a mile in each direction. And there was only one block in the town, which moved around as you went toward Vicksburg, one block with homes on that. Otherwise, there was no way of going around the block in this small town. Now, behind the grocery store was an establishment in which an individual sold some insurance from upstairs, but the barbershop below no longer functioned. People went 6 miles away to use the barbershop if they wanted. My mother cut everybody's hair in the household, so we didn't use a barbershop. I had to wait till I was in high school before I had haircuts in a barbershop. Then beyond that was a little establishment that you would call a hardware store, which did not exist there in 1940. But when the war ended, an individual who was the same age as my oldest brother named Cliff Munn came back, and in the Navy, he had learned to be an electrician. And so he opened a hardware store, built it out of block, and that's where you would go to buy the whetstones and fittings for a sink and other things. So he served as a plumber and as an electrician and any number of other things around the town. He was a very, very nice fellow, and he loved to visit, gossip, have a good time, because he once came to our house to repair and replace some of the wiring in our attic. And I would look back on this and say that that probably was an hour and a half job. He was at our house for 5 hours. We made toast and peanut butter, we made popcorn, we did everything else in between handling the wiring in the attic at this time. So, nice fellow. Now, next to that structure was a house. And in this house lived Johnny Sherman. That's what everybody called him. And in the rear of his house, he had a license to sell packaged alcoholic beverages, only beer. And you have to take those out the rear door, and there were back steps there. And so that's where people would stop who drank beer. My family didn't drink any alcoholic beverages. And so a car would stop in front, they'd go in with their case of empty bottles, and they would come out with the bottles and put them in the trunk. I remember Mrs. Mordyke, who was a teacher at Fulton School, every 2 weeks took a case in and took out a full case for her husband, Herb. That means the school teacher was talked about in the small town. All right, Mrs. Mordyke was stopped in front of Johnny Sherman's again, getting her case for Herb. So people would talk, I would hear all of this at the breakfast or dinner table somewhere. So I knew all of these things. Beyond that, there were 2 houses, then the Fulton School, which was a 2-storied school, but only, of course, went to the 8th grade. And then homes on out the rest of the way. On the other side, next to the Sinclair station, was an establishment where farm machinery was repaired, and cartridges and things for hunting were sold in this particular store. Behind the Sinclair station to the north was the town hall. And I've already talked to you about the town hall and how important that particular structure was, from everything from Boy Scouts to potluck dinners every other Wednesday for the Farm Bureau, as well as other meetings that might be needed one way or another. When the time came, when I was about 10 or 11, when Fulton collected the money and had its own fire engine and had to train volunteers for the fire engine, they cut an opening in that building so that in on the floor the fire truck could be parked. You merely had to pull the fire truck out when you had functions in your town hall, which was just one large single open building about half the size of a basketball court, with folding wooden chairs to be set up in each case and tables to be set up for your potluck dinners. Beyond that was a little one-story structure, which was both store and living quarters for a lady named Mert Lloyd. And Mert had a frontis area no larger than this here. And there she sold chops, cuts of meat, bread, crackers, maybe 12 or 13 items. And I think she was a widow, but I do not know if she was a widow. But she was in her 60s by the time we reached World War II, and a kindly lady, but she did not have the kind of things that would attract my brother and I, because there was no candy there, and there was no Coca-Cola and no peanuts, the things that you would buy at a gas station or a regular large store. The store that did the best on the other corner was run by a kindly gentleman named Kramer, and it wasn't until he died when I was about 12 or 13 that I found out what his true first name was. I always thought his name was Oat, but his real name was Otis. And I didn't know that until I went to the funeral. Otherwise, individuals are often called simply by a name that you hear your parents and others call them. A farmer close to us who was a very good friend of my brother's and fished and hunted with them all the time. I didn't know until I was an adult that his name was Chalmers. Instead, he was always Chetty to everyone, and nobody ever used a different name besides Chetty. His brother's name was Carlton, and he, of course, was Carley. But I didn't see as much of him because Carley went into the service during World War II, so there's a 4-year gap from the time I'm 6 to the time I'm 10 where I never saw Carley. And that was true with Cliff Munn and many individuals in the area during World War II. So you have the structure of this town then. And what I'm building up to here is to tell you what I consider, as an adult, looking back upon my childhood and the stories I heard, and keep in mind the stories I heard were the gossip at the dinner or supper table. And that's how I would know this. It wasn't because I had studied any political science or government at this time, but I knew election day, I knew what it meant, and I knew the most important person elected in Fulton was, because Fulton was the most important town of 102 or 5, would be your county supervisor, the person who went to Kalamazoo to represent your township, Waukesha Township. So, back to the structure of the town and some of the individuals in the town, I want to give you an example of good government, which I would not have been able to evaluate then, only the people involved, how you trusted them and the feelings you had about them when you were a boy between 5 and 10 years of age. So, the players in all of this story that I would like to tell you about, well, first let me tell you some of the other characters in the town so you know you have a feel for all these individuals. There was an individual who lived on the east end of the town. I would call him retired because he was too old to work his farm. He probably, during the time that I was 6 or 7 years of age, probably in his 60s or late 60s. He would have been classified today as legally blind, although he did wear glasses. They were very thick. And he had a difficult time with the Kalamazoo Gazette, and he would sit in the sunlight next to the gas station, hold it way out with his thick glasses, and he was able to discern some of it. But as all individuals who had time on their hands then, every day in the afternoon you listened to the radio and you listened to the Detroit Tiger baseball games. This gentleman's name was John Tilson. He had no teeth. I never remembered him to have teeth, and he never wore false teeth. But he would come to the Sinclair station in the wintertime to sit around the pot-bellied stove, and there was no baseball then, but in the summertime on a bench outside one of the windows, and he would buy 1 bag of Planters peanuts. And with no teeth, he would sit there during an entire 9-inning Tiger baseball game, announced by the Tiger announcer of that time period and a Hall of Fame baseball player, Harry Heilman, who was brought to us by Goebel Beer. Must have been a Detroit band. I never saw the label as a boy. But either way, Goebel Beer. Tilson, John Tilson, would sit there and gum a whole bag of Planters peanuts. Probably cost 3 cents then. And it would take him 9 innings without teeth in order to manipulate in his mouth those peanuts so that he could swallow all of them. So that's one character in the town. Another character in the town was a fellow named Charlie Kramer. And Charlie was a World War I vet. And he really didn't work, but he had a government veterans check that came to him so he could survive, and he loved to fish and he loved to hunt. My brother hunted and fished with him often, as did other members of the town. And he still had the wool clothing, much of it left over from World War I, and sometimes he would wear something that would interest my brother and I, and he would talk about war stories and other things of this type. Now Charlie, I do not know how old he was this time, but probably in his 60s. And Charlie was tall, had a pot belly, loved to drink beer, especially special occasions like Saturday night, especially at barn dances where they put it in horse tanks with ice and things of this type. And Charlie was kind of a character, and he was a griper about a lot of things, and he also sold some insurance on the side. How much of a living he made from that, I did not know, but I do know that he had an office, or constituted an office, above the closed barber shop, but I was never up in that area at any time. But he always appeared at the gas station every day. Now, a story that I must tell you that I don't remember myself because I did not observe this, but my next to the oldest brother, remember the one who asked me the question about sleeping in the room with Orville and Marie? He told me this story much later as I was older, maybe 16 or 17 years old, and I had made a comment on Charlie Kramer much later. My older brother said, yes, I may not have been born yet when this occurred. But he said Charlie would come to the gas station, and Charlie still had his teeth at that time. And he would come into the gas station, and he'd wrench his mouth around, and this and that. And the man who ran the gas station, Wooster, would say, what's the matter, Charlie? Teeth ache? And Charlie would say, no, but they're bitching around getting ready to. Interesting observation. Never thought of anybody anticipating that their teeth were going to ache on them. By the time I came to know Charlie Kramer or pay attention to him, and in the winter he would wear a big hunting coat, and in the summer something lighter, of course, but quite often those green, dark green, or the typical World War I uniform colored pants, and he evidently retained a lot of those, and those were kind of his dress pants when he wasn't fishing or hunting. He would come to the gas station, he didn't have teeth. And as a result, he sucked on his lips all the time. So while he was standing there getting out money to buy a Coke or a candy bar or something else at the gas station, he had this fashion or habit. And he did this all the time. But he did have false teeth, but he only wore them when he put them on for special occasions, such as a barn dance or a Farm Bureau picnic, where he had to put his teeth in. Otherwise, he never wore the teeth. So Charlie was kind of a character. As a matter of fact, I don't remember all the details, but I heard the gossip at the supper table that Charlie Kramer went to some function like a barn dance or something and had a little bit too much to drink, and he lost his teeth. And the next day he was there in the morning in the grass where he'd been standing drinking beer by the horse tank, and he was on his hands and knees looking around, wearing his glasses now, looking around trying to find the false teeth that he had lost. That's one of the characters of the town. Another one would be an individual who ran the gas station kitty-cornered from the Sinclair station, whose last name was Clark, but was always called by everybody simply Clarky. And Clarky was not married. I think he was a widower, but he married Mrs. Barrett, who ran the establishment we called the hotel, but wasn't truly a hotel, although some people lived upstairs there. Regulars lived in the town. And Mrs. Barrett, he married her, and so they sold ice cream and a few other sundry items. But Clarky, his distinction in the town, ruddy complexion, large bulbous nose, and always wore the kind of hat that you would think a policeman might wear, with that glossy patent leather type of bill to it, and a little cigar his mouth that he seldom lit, but it was there. And he wore shirts that always had those bands right here to keep the sleeves up a little bit. So he ran that gas station until he helped Mrs. Barrett, married Mrs. Barrett, and helped her run the ice cream establishment. But Clarkey's distinction was he was the best horseshoe pitcher in the township. And if you went to the Kalamazoo County Fair and you went to the horseshoe pits, which was always available for an open tournament, Clarkey would be seen there, working his way up the ladder, second seed, third seed, always there. And go to the south, about 14 miles to another county, and Calhoun County, and there you would find him also, right? Pitching horseshoes at the county fair, always seated in one way or another. That's the way he would spend the whole week in the competition, every day at the county fair. So those are three of the types of characters that we have in the town. There was a blowhard that lived in a nice home that was made of brick, and his wife was the one that wore all the makeup and perfume. And we knew a lot about her because she was a member of a club that my mother was a member of as well, and they merely gathered together once a month to play cards, a game called bunco. And I don't to this day have any idea how you play bunco, but I do know that once a year, because they had 13 members in case somebody were ill and couldn't come, because it took 12 to have the tables to play the cards like people play fours for bridge. And one day a year it would be at our farm home. So that was the day that I knew that when all the women went out to say goodbye to each other and were entering their cars, I could go around and sip some of the leftover coffee in their cups, because I grew up loving coffee very, very much. But that wife of this gentleman, Blowhard, his name was Marv Bittner, and he was always condescendingly telling people this and that. He ran a painting service of some kind or another, and as a result, he seemed more prosperous than others. He's the only one that had a Cadillac in the town. So, town characters of one kind or another. Now, I want to tell you a story, and we are leading up to something called what I consider an example of wise, or as the British Prime Minister in the 19th century would call judicious government, meaning you make wise, equitable decisions, and that's what good government is all about. Because everyone must understand, when you become an adult, that you live in a society that is a combination of laws and people, and neither will function alone. You need the combination of the two, the wise use of the law by the people, passing wise laws by individuals and administrators one way or another, but they can't operate alone. You need both working together, which I would never have been able to discern at that age, but either way, the example I'm going to give you will show you that. So the players in this situation are three. One, the lady that had the little store that sold a few chops and a few items, Mert Lloyd. And Mert Lloyd had a boyfriend. He was what you call a hired man. He lived on a farm and worked for room, board, and a little extra in wages. And that was 1.25 miles north of town. He did not have transportation unless somebody happened to be driving by and dropped him off in town. Otherwise, you would see Bill Teal, her boyfriend, and my brother and I, young, we used to kid about it and call her Mert Teal. And we thought this was kind of cute because this was always discussed at the dinner table, and you would hear, oh, well, I noticed Bill Teal was at Mert Lloyd's last night. So you would understand these things, and you'd listen as a child. Now, Mert Lloyd was a very kindly lady with gray hair, in her 60s, probably by the time we reach 1944, maybe 65, moving to the area where she might be qualified for a pension, one kind or another. On Saturday nights, Bill Teal used to come into town, and for a while in Fulton on Saturday nights there would be shown free movies, and we showed them at the ballpark and at the backstop on the ballpark area, which was just north of the quote hotel unquote, a large field owned by one of the farmers, but he didn't till it because the town needed it for a ballpark. And we only had one bench behind each part of the backstop, and there was no other seating there. People brought folding chairs or sat on a blanket. But pickup games were played there always on Sunday afternoons, usually not on weekdays unless it were a holiday, because most of the people that would play would be farmers, and you must use the good weather properly, you don't just go play baseball. And by the time you become 10 years old, you have enough duties on the farm that you can't play on a weekday or Saturday in the daytime unless it's a holiday or some special festivity. You would have work to do. So, free movies might be shown there and people would come to town and Bill Teal would walk into town. Mert would go over to Johnny Sherman's through the back door, would come back with a bag, and it was obviously she was bringing 6 bottles of beer for her and Bill. And they would sit next to her structure on the little drive that went by that one-story structure, and she lived in the back in 2 chairs in the darkness, but we all knew where they were sitting, and sit there on a Saturday night and visit and sip beer together. So you could call that kind of an aged romance in the town. Everybody knew about it, nothing unusual, nobody harmed, comfortable situation. So player number 1, Mert Lloyd. Player number 2 in all of this is a woman named Cora Vickers. She was always very kind to my brother and I, gave us 50 cents to mow her lawn, not in town, but her lawn on the farm property she owned. Now, Cora Vickers was also a woman in her 60s, and she was a widow, and her husband had been the town undertaker, which means he was probably the most prosperous individual in the town. And he owned an 80-acre farm with a large house, plenty of barn facilities and other things, but was too old to farm it, and my brother usually farmed the Vickers place, or other farmers close by farmed the property. And they did it on a share basis so that there was an income from that farm for Marshall Vickers, the undertaker of the town, and his wife Cora. But he passed away when I was about 5 years old. And then, but my brother and I, between the two of us on each side of a push mower, could mow the lawn at the farm, and she would give us 50 cents to split for doing that. We'd buy a little ice cream, Planters peanuts, and of course Pepsi Cola. We usually didn't drink Coca-Cola because Pepsi came in a 12-ounce bottle and Coke in an 8-ounce bottle. So we chose the economic way for our bottle of pop or popsicles, whatever we might buy. Now, you have Cora Vickers, a widow. She lives in what is the largest, best-looking, white, Victorian-style home in Fulton. Just 2 houses away from the gas station, large and stately, with veranda up there and all the things not associated with any home that we visited to speak of. But she was very kind to my brother and I. But she was one of the domineering people in the town, and she attended the Reformed Church, which was to the east end of town. Halfway there on the east end of town was the Methodist Church, and that's the one we attended. Those are the 2 churches, of course, that alternated in dinner and supper on election day and other festivities of one kind or another. So we have Cora Vickers, she's the other player. Needless to say, her son-in-law has inherited the undertaking business, and he operates it. A fine gentleman named Hugh Burke, and his wife was an elementary school teacher, Miriam Burke. Wonderful lady. One of the finest ladies I've ever met. Or, as Andy Griffith would tell you, fine folk, fine folk. But obviously, Cora Vickers, having the inheritance of her husband, having this large established house that she didn't have to pay for in the town, having the income from a farm besides all of that, Cora Vickers was probably, may have been the wealthiest person in the town in terms of sustenance and what she had in her possession. Now, that's player number 2. Player number 3 lives south of the town. As a matter of fact, about 600 yards south of our farm on the opposite side of the road. His name was Harry Lawrence, and he was the finest gentleman anybody could ever meet. By this time, he had snow-white hair. My brother farmed all of his farm, but Harry still was in physical condition that he milked 2 or 3 cows, kept a few hogs, and also had a 1-acre garden next to his house so that he and his wife Jessie could grow all the things that she would need to can for the wintertime. And Jessie was a wonderful lady, and they had no children. So this was a favorite place for my brother and I to visit. My brother was always there farming the farm, and then eventually I ended up participating, logging bales and other things on his farm. So he was a very fine gentleman, and he always had the Tiger baseball game on the radio, either in the house if it's cold or on the front porch, so you could always check if you were moving by there how the Tigers were doing. So a very, very fine gentleman. And he would never give up milking the cows, and if he had to go on a vacation or be gone for 2 or 3 days, well, my brother milked the cows for him while he was gone, or when I became a little older, I milked his cows for him while he was gone. 2 times a day, and you can't overlook that, or you'll decrease the amount of milk that the cow will give down in the future. And of course they would need milk for the household use, to make cottage cheese, other things, separate the cream so they could churn their own butter, and any milk that you have left over that you don't need, from which you've taken the cream, will be skim milk, and you can always add that with water and meal and all your table scraps, potato peelings and everything else into this large tub, which you dip into with a bucket, 3 gallons, and you slop your hogs with that, so that you add to the other food that they have, quite apart from the meal, the corn, and other things you would feed the hogs. Jesse also made enough sugar cookies to take care of a family of 8 with regularity, and there was just Harry and Jesse. So you know my brother and I always had plenty of sugar cookies. Anytime we dropped by, we could walk out with 3 sugar cookies. Harry Lawrence was the most respected man in the community. And he was our county supervisor. And as long as I lived there, as I grew up, and all through that time period, until he retired, and after he lost Jesse, he was our county supervisor. I do not know how many townships there were in Kalamazoo County. I'm guessing there were probably 30, maybe 24. But each one had a supervisor that went to meetings in Kalamazoo, but they all didn't attend all the time. Certain ones among them were elected as a steering committee of maybe 6 or 8, and they made the crucial decisions for the county with regard to tax assessment, road construction, road expansion and widening, other things of this type. And during World War II, they would have to operate as the dispenser of the funds that were paid out by Franklin Roosevelt's WPA, because many individuals who were without work at that time in the late Depression, and we didn't enter the war, really can't say we're into the war until 1942 because of December 7, 1941. So there were plenty of unemployed people, and those individuals worked on the roads with the county crews and received a pittance. When I say a pittance, it's enough to buy milk, it's enough to buy flour, it's enough to buy dried beans and the other things that give you girth, and baked bread, other things that you need to survive in very tough times in American history. So Harry Lawrence would have been on that steering committee, so he was one of the most important county supervisors. And quite often he might invite my brother and I to ride to Kalamazoo with him when he went to meetings, and we would ride in his 41 Chevrolet, and he would allow us, we knew our way around Kalamazoo. Kalamazoo had 7 moving picture shows, so we could always choose what we wanted to do in the afternoon. It only cost 12 cents for a double feature. And we would see the show and then be home in time for evening chores, feeding the chickens, mealing the cows, whatever. So he was very close to us, and my oldest brother was kind of like a son to him because we cut his wood and stacked it next to his house from his modest forest on about an 80-acre farm, plus we did all the tilling and the harvesting on that farm. Excuse me. So we knew him very well. So a respected man. Or let me put it this way, there are only certain people in your community at this time that you would choose to be the umpire at a pickup baseball game or even an organized baseball game that might occur in your town. And you needed someone that was so absolutely respected by all that as you grew up, you knew the respect that all of your parents and others had for these individuals. That's the person who would be tabbed to be the umpire, because there would never be an argument during the game, no carping or griping, because that individual was too well respected. You would never dare question a decision made by that umpire. I only knew of 3. Harry Lawrence would have been the premium one, and he would do that in his Sunday slacks, a white shirt, and one of those straw dress hats, very gentlemanly, and be your umpire. He also had those bands that would keep your sleeves up on your white shirt, but that was the proper dress for a Sunday afternoon ball game. A second one was a fellow named Cad Harrison. I do not remember what his first name was, but he lived 3/4 of a mile from us, across the way, and he was that respected as well. And the other was the individual who ran the elections whenever we had them in town, that gentleman named Ben Weedle. wore the same type of hat, also had those bands that held his shirt up, right? And a large hook nose. Those three individuals, always the umpire, because nobody would ever question them, any circumstances. Now, your third player then is Harry Lawrence, the county supervisor. Now, I heard all of this at the dinner table as gossip passed around. And I knew all of the players very, very well, but as a boy of, let's say, 7 or 8. And it was revealed at the dinner table that both Cora Vickers and Mert Lloyd had reached the age where they qualified for a county pension. Because the county had a system where an indigent widow, or a widow who needed help in order to sustain themselves, could receive a modest pension. I have no idea how much it was, but if we're talking 1942, 43, I would guess it's probably $38 a month. I have no idea. Under 50, let's say. And they qualified by age at the same time. Well, you already know the contrast between the two. Cora Vickers is the most prosperous lady in the town. And everybody knows that. And everybody likes her just fine. But Cora was a very proper lady, somewhat authoritarian in her influences as to how things ought to be. Right? Lives in a nice stately home, very prominent on the board of the Reformed Church, and her son-in-law is on the board of the Reformed Church as well. So very, very prominent in the town. High visibility. We use that word today, high visibility in position. Now, who's Mert Lloyd? Mert Lloyd, a kindly little lady. You almost never see her out walking around. She lives in a building that hasn't been painted in my lifetime that I've ever seen. Ekes out a very modest living, wears very shabby common clothes and so forth. And the only thing she does that can draw attention by someone is to sit there beside that establishment in the dark on a Saturday night, warm out there, and sharing a bottle of beer with Bill Teal. And so, it's the County Board of Supervisors that have to manage the money for the county. And I use the word judicious, or use the word equity. So obviously the approval of anybody being added to the county rolls to receive a modest stipend of $38 a month has to be approved by the board county supervisors. And Harry Lawrence voted. Remember now, it's his township. He knows the township. Somebody in another township 30 miles away over near the city of Kalamazoo does not know the conditions of our particular township. Everybody knows everybody and their conditions. You know who chews tobacco and who doesn't, who smokes a pipe and who doesn't, who wears bib overalls and who wears the belt type. You know everybody. And therefore Harry Lawrence would be the chief resource to making recommendations on these two widows who might receive that modest stipend. And Harry Lawrence recommended that Mert Teal receive her stipend and Cora Vickers not receive the stipend because regardless of Cora's age, she was the most prosperous female in the town. She didn't need it. There were other people in the county that certainly needed it more, and Harry would understand that. Harry was a respectable gentleman, and he believed in what we would call wise and equitable government or wise use of public funds. Well, Cora Vickers, and I learned about all of this at the dinner table, of course, was absolutely furious. How dare him not recommend her? How dare he? Why didn't the County Board of Supervisors approve for her $38 a month? Why Mert Lloyd? Why, Mert Lloyd will just walk over to Johnny Sherman's and she'll be buying beer with that stipend. She'll sit there on Saturday night and drink it with Bill Teal, right? So-and-so's hired man. That's not right. Cora was a respectable person in the town. Who's Mert Lloyd? She drinks beer on Saturday night, doesn't she? So Cora created a furor over this. I didn't know it except that what I heard at the dinner table. And so as it passed, in a short time, elections rolled around, and Cora Vickers saw to it that someone else ran for the office, and she was going to make certain that she defeated Harry Lawrence for this. Well, as a boy, it would bother me that anybody would want to defeat Harry Lawrence. He's just like a kindly grandfather to me. Why? I really didn't understand why she would take that attitude. Furthermore, I knew Cora Vickers well, and we ate lunch at her house from time to time, and she paid us to mow the lawn, and we knew her very, very well. But why would she do this? I didn't understand high politics, and this is as high as you can have them in a township or a county. And so she encouraged the blowhard Marv Bittner to run for county supervisor. She was going to show that Harry Lawrence. Well, wouldn't you know, come election time, Harry Lawrence won the election, hands down, just as he always would. Because no matter what Cora Vickers said, or how much anybody liked Cora Vickers, when you quietly went into the polling booth, you knew who you trusted most to use the funds of your township or your county in the wisest fashion. It's the same person that you would choose to umpire your ball game, the same person from whom you might buy your insurance. Those are the types of people that you respect. When it comes to that vote, you want to be secure. No management here in any fashion. But either way, that's my example that I observed when I was between 5 and 10 in a small town or rural area of good government. And it is indeed good government. And that would be the best that you could find. Now I'd like to tell you about some other institutions associated with small town life and how everybody knows all other individuals. One of the characters I mentioned in this town was the individual who ran from out of his house. In the front you could buy ice cream and potato chips. In the rear he had the only license to sell packaged beer and ale. And his name was Johnny Sherman. And Johnny was a very, very nice fellow and very kind to us, but Johnny was a widower. And Johnny also had a girlfriend, and her name was Mrs. Purdy, but because of what I heard my older brothers say at the dinner table, why we always referred to her as Ma, or Ma Purdy. And Johnny, he liked to tip some of the commodity that he sold as well, and so did Ma Purdy, who was a widow. And so quite often, Ma Purdy would come up, and when Johnny Sherman's place was closed, he and Ma Purdy would tip a few, or else he would go to Ma Purdy's house, which was about 7 or 8 miles to the south of us near a town named Leonidas, and they might tip some there. But Johnny always had to drive home, and he had a 37 two-door Chevy that he would drive home. And one night, it was in good weather, one night, evidently Johnny and Ma Purdy had a bit too much to drink, and they were returning to Johnny Sherman's place in Fulton. And about a quarter of a mile south of our house, Johnny Sherman ran off the road with his Chevy into the ditch right near Harry Lawrence's farm. And so I didn't know anything about this until the breakfast table the next morning. And my brother was telling my older sisters, my oldest brother was telling my oldest sisters about it because my father had been awakened in the night. And it seems that Johnny Sherman crawled, because evidently he couldn't walk under the circumstances, and his car was off, tilted on its side in the ditch. In this fashion, he couldn't back it out. And he crawled all the way to our farm. He did not stop. Harry Lawrence did not have a tractor. The people kitty-cornered across the way did not have a tractor. They only had 5 acres, raised chickens, things of this type. So he came to our place because he knew we had a farm all-age tractor. And he crawled all the way. And this is what's reported at the breakfast table between my oldest brother and 2 of my sisters, and my father's present there. And he beat on the door, and my father got up and realized here's Johnny Sherman, and Johnny Sherman doesn't have any knees in his trousers any longer. He had crawled all that way and worn the knees through, and his knees were a little bit bloody. And my father then calls my brother down from upstairs, because all the boys slept upstairs, 4 of us. And he called him down, and I didn't hear any of this, and it's like 2 in the morning. And so my brother then fires up the farm all-age tractor, log chain, other things, goes on down the road by Harry Lawrence's farm, hooks it onto the rear of the bumper of Johnny Sherman's car to pull him out in the same direction that he had entered into the ditch. Before my brother does this, he says, "Is there anybody in that car, Johnny?" Johnny says, "No, nobody in there." So he pulls the car out, establishes it so that it's all right on the road. My brother helps him start it. starts up his car, he's ready to leave, and my brother notices that asleep in the front seat, nudged over to one side, is Ma Purdy. But Johnny had said, no, there's no one in that car. Now, am I supposed to know private things like this about individuals in town? Sooner or later it will all spread, won't it? And you'll have all of these stories that are told here and there. And if you're young and you're listening, you hear it in each case. Just like you hear about the conduct of individuals at the county fair at night. As children, we only went to county fairs in the daytime, of course. And you would hear about the barn dances and who did this or that. And it wasn't the first time which somebody had to be pulled out. My brother pulled others out within 2 miles of our house who had gone to a barn dance and had too much to drink and then just ran off the road and went to sleep. And the next day they come to our farm and want their Model A pulled out of the ditch. So this is not an unusual occurrence at that time. And it always created something of discussion in our household, of course, because our household was one of those that was a teetotaling family. Although one time somebody ran out of gas near our farm who came from Chicago. And they were passing our farm, and I don't know where they were going, maybe to Detroit, but why they were off the main highway by 6 miles, I don't know, but they ran out of gas. And we kept gas on the farm, large amounts of it, and we had, as World War II, you had to have a sticker for a certain amount of gas, A, B, C, and the ultimate amount, D, and we had all 4 because of the farm equipment we had to run, and it's wartime, and the goods are needed. So we had plenty of gas. The person stopped and wanted some gas, and my father put a gallon of gas in his car so he could drive on down to where he could find a gas station 6 miles away. About a year later, that gentleman passed our farm again, stopped in, drove in, wanted to say thank you one more time for saving him in this difficult situation, and gave us a bottle of whiskey. And I can even tell you, it said Seagram's on it. We didn't say anything. My father took it, placed it in a cabinet, and by this time we had an indoor bathroom that had a sink, a tub, and a toilet, and a little cupboard. And my father placed it in that cupboard. And from that point on, we had what is known as medicinal whiskey. And so if the time came, and my mother did not want, because of your cough and your extremely raw throat, if she did not want to bake onions, which she used to do, she would bake raw onions in large amounts until they just collapsed into a state in which all the juice ran out of the onions into this tray, and then she would take the tray and she would make us drink 1/3 of a coffee cup of onion juice, which she said was very good for sore throats and chest congestion and things of this type. But once we had the whiskey, and I was about 10 or 11 by then they had this bottle of whiskey there, and I'm sure the bottle of whiskey must have lasted at least 4 or 5 years. But she would take the whiskey and take a cup and put a spoon of sugar in it, and then she would put a jigger of whiskey in it, or something like a jigger. We didn't own a jigger. And then she would add scalding hot water until the cup was about half full. And then you were forced to chug-a-lug that immediately as fast as you could. And that would happen at bedtime. And the heat from that was supposed to be beneficial for your throat and for your chest and other things. So we did have medicinal whiskey. Later, when I was in college, we had a pint of Old Crow, which is strong whiskey, in the house. And by this time I was in college, and I got a very raw throat one time, and my mother says, well, you need some of that Old Crow for your throat and your voice is affected and everything else. You need some of that. And so she got the hot water out, and she put it in there, and she put the whiskey in with it, and she was about ready to put the sugar in. I said, no, forget the sugar. I don't want that sugar, and so forth. And so I drank it, and my mother looked at me, and by this time I was 20 years old, looked at me and said, you were able to do that without the sugar? A little bit suspicious of my conduct there. But yes, I was able to do it without the sugar, and I didn't really want the sugar. Either way, characters and situations that you have on the farm. Now, I'm leading up to something for people who arrive at a particular age where you are a widower or a widow. And there was an institution of considerable interest, and I was never involved in any of this until I was about 10 or 11. And it is an institution in rural areas, I don't know that it's done in cities, called a belling bee. And the word Bellingby comes from ringing bells and making lots of noise. But as things would happen, sometimes an individual is a widower and he's 60 or 65 years old. And then he marries a widow of similar age. Now they're all already both well known in the community. So when they have their wedding, it's not particularly formal, right? Nothing fancy about the wedding, nothing romantic as such. But you would know where they would live, and they might live on a farm, or they might live in one of the houses in the small town. I went to 2 Bellingbys at houses in the small town of Fulton, and I went to 2 different Bellingbys, maybe 3, on farms in different locations. And the whole purpose of the Bellingby is when the widow and widower marry, and after they've been married about 3 nights, you go to their house in a large group in party form, maybe 18, 25 of you all together. And you go when you know, because this time you know everybody. You know what time they turn out their lights at night. They sit right by one chair, reading the Kalamazoo Gazette or Life magazine or something, and you know that click, 10 o'clock, the light's going out. And so you're all prepared, and you arrive there about 10:20 when they've had time to dress for bed and definitely be in bed. And then everybody runs around their house, banging on pots and pans, ringing bells, screaming, yelling, get up, get up, get up. And of course, eventually a porch light will come on, and the couple in their night clothing will appear on the porch to see what the problem is, and then you congratulate them for being married. Now, if they are living in that community and they understand the community, then they are going to react by being pleased. You've shown appreciation for them, shown that you like them by giving this amount of attention to them. And they are going to open their door, and if it's warm, they will come on outside and bring lemonade or make a pot of coffee and bring cookies and other things for everybody to share outside. You might bring presents, simple presents, joke presents of one kind or another to them, but it's a way of showing your appreciation and celebrating the wedding, hence the term Bellingby. And the most interesting one that I ever attended involved an individual who was, in fact, a bachelor, not a widower. No, he was a widower. He was a widower. And for all the time that I grew up, very young, he was Warren Springer. And as I grew up, he always had housekeepers. And he would hire a housekeeper, and sometimes the housekeeper would have a son or a daughter, and she would attend the same one-room country school we did. But he was a cantankerous individual and hard to get along with, and quite often there was a spat between the housekeeper and himself, who was a live-in housekeeper with her daughter or son. And then she would leave, and it'd be 2 or 3 days when he was alone, and then he would go to Kalamazoo and plead and beg and convince her to come back. And so she would come back, and so you often looked upon them as a couple, but you knew that they weren't husband and wife. And so this individual, Warren Springer, right, and by the way, he was a strange individual in that he always stayed up until at least midnight reading by a lamp in the front room, very close to the front door, and you could tell exactly when he would turn it out, and yet he was the earliest riser in the community. Maybe he took naps, I don't know, but by 4 a.m. in the morning, he would already be on a tractor working his property. Very, very early riser. So it happened when I was about 11, I was at least 12 or 13, because I was driving by then, and I could drive one of my brother's pickups or dump truck any place I wanted to go in the neighborhood. Laws in Michigan at that time indicated you could have a driver's license at age 14 if you were rural and on a farm and needed to drive farm equipment on the roads, and the driver's license would be good for 20 miles from your farm, either driving trucks or farm equipment, and only in the daytime. But that was permitted. But I was already driving dump trucks and pickups all around the roads in our township and a general area by the time I was 12. And I'd learned before I could reach the pedals hard. I had to put pillows behind me just to do that, but I drove them around the fields to back them up for the dumpers and the hoppers to be unloaded in the grain and drive it up to the granary and help unload it and other things by the time I was 11 or 12. So that particular night, my friend Max Loker said, hey, there's going to be a Bellingby tonight because Warren Springer, he married that new housekeeper that he has. The big, heavy-set one? He says, yes, well, we're going to have a Bellingby for them. You want to go? And I said, yes. I said, okay, I'll be over and pick you up. So I picked up Max and his sister, whose farm was only a half a mile away from our farm, in the dump truck. And we all rallied at a particular place close to a one-room country school that was no longer in operation. And we gathered there, so there were 8 or 10 cars, lots of people in the cars, and we only had to go 3/4 of a mile down the road when the lights went out. And we paused, and as soon as the lights went out on that farmhouse, then we moved in, not too close, and walked the rest of the distance, and then started circling the house, beating on pots and pans and everything else. And I was standing next to a farmer that lived about 2.5 miles from us, and his name was Snyder, and I do not know what his first name was. He was always called Short, Shorty Snyder, because he was in fact short. He had 14 kids. And so he was standing right beside me, and the lights went on in the house when we were banging things, and there I stood with Short Snyder, Short's wife, and Short. And the lights went on, and here was the huge, heavy-set new wife of Warren Springer, stark naked, standing in the bedroom looking for something to put on. And Short is staring, and his wife says, "Come on, Short, you've seen a woman like that before." And Short said, "Never one quite like that." But either way, they put on some clothing, came out, and eventually, in a short time, we had lemonade, cookies, and all the other nice things that you might enjoy, and they knew that the neighborhood appreciated them. I do not know if spelling bees occur anymore in any way, shape, or form, but either way, that's an example of how a spelling bee would occur in a local community. Tell you one last story here before we end this particular segment, and it involves pickles. And the boy I mentioned named Max Loker, his mother made the best sweet pickles everybody would concede anywhere. I don't know what the recipe was, but she had them in these large crocks in her pantry, 2 rooms behind the kitchen. And Max, I used to stay overnight with him with some regularity. And so when we would stay overnight, we slept in a room leading to the pantry in which the milk separator was located. And there was a window, and the head of the bed was right next to that. And Max slept in that room. So I slept there with Max. And Miriam Loker's pickles were now about ready to remove from the crocks and place in quart jars. And so Max and I went into bed about 9:30, and it was dark and so forth. He sat there, and Max said, "You want a pickle?" I said, "Yes." "Go." So we quietly tiptoed down into the pantry, and here are these huge crocks that must have held 12 gallons apiece, 4 or 5 of them. And we reached in, took the top off, reached in, took out a pickle, and my, what a delicious pickle. So we started taking more pickles, and we went back to the bedroom, and there behind us was the windowsill, and we stacked pickles on the windowsill 2 deep, all the way from one side to the other. And then we laid in bed, and we only had to reach over the back of our heads like this to choose a pickle. And we ate all of them before we fell asleep. And I might point out, I can't recall any adverse effects whatsoever from eating 15 or 20 pickles on a single evening before I fell asleep. It was just fine. Very, very desirable. Max Loker's wife was an excellent cook, and she, at her home, their family had 1 less child than us, but down the line of the family, the oldest male was the same age as the oldest male in ours, and then the next daughter down was the same age as one of my sisters, and moved on down, so almost similar ages. And so we were involved in all sorts of things together all the time, whether it's on Sunday at one house when it's snowing outside and everybody's playing cards and eating popcorn at that house, or eating popcorn and playing cards, apples or something, at our house on a Sunday afternoon, especially when it's blizzard type of weather. But Miriam Loker was a very good cook, and Miriam Loker also made the largest breakfasts every morning. Now, at my home, my mother might have cornmeal mush, which she had prepared, and now it's solidified, sitting on a cold porch, and she can slice it into strips this wide and this thick, and then she can fry it in fresh butter that we have churned, and that is your substitute for potatoes for breakfast. And then there would be eggs and sausage, or eggs and bacon with that. And you might have a piece of toast if you wanted. My mother baked her own bread, so the toast had to be made in the oven because no toaster would hold the size of her loaves because they were this big. And you could have that type of breakfast. Sometimes, my father always insisted on potatoes for breakfast, and so if we weren't in a position where we had leftover potatoes from the night before in which you could make potato cakes, or chopped potatoes in which you could scramble eggs and chunks of bacon in with it, my mother would just boil potatoes for my father, peel them and boil them. And he would have whole potatoes, he would mash them up, put butter on, and he would have them with his breakfast in that fashion. But the broth that cooked out of the potatoes, the juice, the water and the broth cooking from the potatoes, as she prepared those, she would take those, and when we were small boys, she would take a nice piece of her homemade bread, smear butter on the top, lay it on a plate like a fat pancake, and then take potato broth and pour it over the top. And that's how you ate to fill yourself. But our breakfasts alternated, but always hearty breakfasts, and as we grew older, we did eat cereals of one kind or another. My brother's favorite was Kellogg's Pep, whereas I preferred a crunchy oat cereal of one kind or another. But you needed a hearty breakfast to do the work. Now back to Miriam Loker. If you stayed at Miriam Loker's house, when you arose the next morning, every morning you had a full variety was made. There was juice, tea, and coffee, depending on the choice for anyone. She made pancakes. She had sausage. She had bacon. She had over easy eggs or scrambled eggs each morning, that full variety plus toast. Even with pancakes, toast. And every morning, the full choice, the full variety, 7 days a week. Very, very hearty. So that was always a wise place to stay, and it's wise to arise early enough if you have to go home to do chores and you stayed overnight with a friend and you have to be home in time to milk the cow, so you have to be home by at least 6:45 in the morning. Then it's best to rise early so you can enjoy a good breakfast like that before you go on home. Well, that is all the stories that I will tell you today. Maybe in the future sometime there can be another installment, but we'll leave it there for right now. Thank you.